53. So I think we should start. Yeah, shall we? Yeah.
Yes.
So welcome everyone to the first MEM seminar of 2021 on how science inform policies and decisions on climate and biodiversity. My name is Audrey Chia. I'm the chair of the Program Management Committee of the MEM, which is the Master of Science in Environmental Management and has the support of 9 faculties and schools across NUS. So Professor Koh is a returning Singaporean. He has had 16 years of international research experience in institutions across Switzerland, Australia, and the United States. So his earlier appointments include Swiss National Science Foundation professor at ETH Zurich. He was also the chair of Applied Ecology and Conservation at the University of Adelaide and vice president of Science Partnerships and Innovation at Conservation International Foundation. Professor Koh is now with the Department of Biological Sciences at NUS. And as you can see from this slide, he's also the director of the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. We are very privileged to have Professor Koh address us today. He will speak for about 30 minutes, after which we will have questions and answers. And please get ready your questions, type them in the group chat so that we will not waste any time waiting for questions to be asked after Professor Koh speaks. Thank you. Now over to Professor Koh.
Thanks, Audrey. Thanks very much. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to speak at this MEM seminar series. I think it's a very important event and it's a very important program. So I'm very happy to be doing my small part to be part of this. My name is Lian Pin. I am an applied ecologist. That's my training. I myself also graduated from NUS, from DBS, in fact, the Department of Biological Sciences. So anyway, so I hope you will find the talk useful today. It will be on primarily on nature-based climate solutions. So what are nature-based climate solutions? They are essentially just ways of leveraging the ability of natural ecosystems to sequester and store carbon through the process of photosynthesis, right, to help us combat climate change. Therefore, nature-based solutions are very important for addressing climate change impacts. However, they are not without their trade-offs and their limitations. So in my talk today, I will discuss how science can help to inform our policies and decisions on nature-based solutions for not just climate change mitigation, but also biodiversity conservation. I think many of us here might remember Secretary Rumsfeld making his infamous statement back in 2002. Now, he was, of course, talking about a completely different subject, right? But I think sometimes it's useful to think about a problem or an issue in terms of what we know and what we don't know. So today's presentation will be broken down into 3 main parts. The first part is on what we know about climate change and nature-based solutions. The second part is on what we are beginning to find out. And the third part is on what we don't know, but urgently need to know. So let's first start with what we know. I think we know the problem quite well. If we take the annual average temperature of the planet over the last 170 years or so, color code them on a temperature scale of blue to red, indicating cooler to warmer temperatures, this is what we would see. And if we look at the data for individual countries in our region, we see a very similar trend. So today it is not controversial anymore that our climate has been getting increasingly warmer at local, regional, and global levels. So that's the problem. I think we also know the cause of the problem quite well. It is simply the accumulation of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. On this chart, the blue line shows global annual emissions. It is now close to about 35 to 40 billion tons per year. The pink line shows global carbon dioxide concentration. It is now over 400 parts per million. So we know the problem, we know the cause of the problem. I think we actually also know the solution. We basically have to reverse what we had done in the past 170 years by reducing our emissions to effectively zero. And according to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we need to do that within the next 30 years if we are to achieve the Paris climate goal of limiting global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. In fact, we need to go below zero to also start to remove and reduce carbon dioxide concentration in our atmosphere. The blue lines you see in this IPCC figure on the right indicate different pathways for achieving the Paris climate target. Let's just zoom in on pathway P3. It's just one of the pathways, and P3 represents a middle of the road scenario. And this is the pathway that we will spend a bit more time on. So for the world to achieve net zero emissions by around mid-century, all IPCC pathways, including this P3 pathway, require us to peak our emissions in 2020 or 21, which is this year or last year, in fact, followed by rapid decarbonisation. But most importantly, all pathways also require actions in the brown part of the curve. And the brown part of the curve above the zero line represents opportunities for us to reduce emissions, mainly by avoiding deforestation. For example, by protecting our remaining rainforests that are under threat of loss. And the brown part of the curve below the zero line are opportunities for us to remove emissions, mainly through restoration or reforestation, for example, of mangroves and other blue carbon ecosystems or coastal ecosystems. And together, these are the so-called nature-based climate solutions. And scientists have estimated these solutions to have a combined global climate mitigation potential of up to about 24 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. That's either reducing emissions or sequestering carbon dioxide. So nature-based climate solutions are important because they are an integral part of the solution. They are baked into every IPCC pathway for us to achieve the Paris climate goal. So you see that brown part of the curve in every one of the IPCC pathway, in addition to the gray part, which is the decarbonization strategies or actions. So in other words, even if we manage to decarbonize, which are the gray part of the curves, we could still fall short of our targets, our climate targets, unless we also figure out the science and the practice of implementing these nature-based solutions, which are the brown part of every pathway. So let's move on to part two. What are we beginning to find out? Now, this is another famous person you may recognize. Dr. Fauci famously said that numbers don't lie. He's of course right, but to add to that, we should also note that numbers can and do change over time as we improve our understanding of the world through science. So what I'm about to present to you today are some preliminary research and findings from our research, from our work that we are doing in our center. Now, I emphasize that these are preliminary findings. Most are not yet published, and some may not be publishable until we have more data. But I think these initial insights may be useful to help us understand what we should already be focusing on and where some of the opportunities and challenges might lie. So let's start with the issue of scale. What is the scale of our solution versus the scale of our problem, right? Global emissions, as I mentioned earlier, is around 40 billion tons of CO2 equivalent gases per year. And here I've included emissions of China, the United States, Indonesia, and Singapore, just to give you some perspective. We also know that the mitigation potential of nature-based climate solutions can be up to about 24 billion tons per year. And within the universe of nature-based solutions, we know that the greatest potential lie in avoiding emissions by protecting what we still have, protecting our remaining natural ecosystems. So the first thing we did at the center was to quantify the climate mitigation potential of protecting all tropical forests. And more specifically, we are interested in tropical forests that are facing imminent threat of loss and whereby an intervention and action could potentially avoid that loss. And these are what we call investable forest carbon. So we find that the protection of these investable tropical forests could generate carbon offsets amounting to about almost 2 billion tons per year. And these include terrestrial forests, peat swamp forests, and mangrove forests. And as you can see, this is quite a substantial amount of emissions reduction. The circles you see on this slide are proportional to the numbers they represent. And it may also help countries and companies, the emissions reduction to be had from protecting tropical forests may help countries and companies meet their emissions reduction goals, or even potentially be a source of tradable carbon units. Now, given the huge amount of attention on blue carbon, which is the current buzzword, we zoomed in on blue carbon and ran the same analysis specifically for the protection of mangrove forests using a more refined data set specific to mangroves. We find that protecting mangroves as a solution actually has a relatively small payoff in terms of global climate mitigation. It provides about 0.03 billion tons of CO2 offsets per year or carbon offsets per year. However, blue carbon is obviously still an important solution for the many other co-benefits it delivers, especially at the national and subnational levels. And of course, for the hundreds and millions of people living in these coastal areas and whose lives and livelihoods depend on healthy coastal ecosystems. Now, because our analysis is spatially explicit, we are also able to produce a wall-to-wall map to show where this potential might lie. And we find that much of the potential would come from the Americas and Asia, and the Americas could generate about 0.8 billion tons of investable carbon per year. The number for Asia is slightly less at about 0.6 billion tons per year. And at the country level, Brazil has the largest investable carbon stock at close to about 500 million tons per year. Indonesia is second place at about 0.2 billion tons. And the other countries in the top 5 are Bolivia, DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Malaysia. Now, from a biodiversity conservation perspective, this map is also very interesting. It tells us where forests are under threat and where we can invest to avoid the loss of both carbon and biodiversity by protecting those forests. Of course, it's important to understand that not all investable forest projects are profitable carbon projects, right? Not every green area you see on this map are financially viable. Because like any other economic activity, a carbon project's financial viability depends on a wide range of factors, including the price of carbon, the costs of establishment, of maintenance, and operations of that carbon project. So to help us understand the scale of the potential ROI, or returns on investment, from these forest carbon projects, we produced what is essentially a prospecting map. But in this case, instead of prospecting for precious metals or oil and gas, it is a map that could help investors prospect for carbon. And we find that the vast majority of financially viable and most profitable carbon sites are actually located in the Asia-Pacific region, in our region, with a combined return of up to about 25 billion US dollars per year in net present values. And forest carbon projects in Indonesia alone could generate up to about $10 billion per year in returns from these forest carbon projects. So the potential returns may be quite substantial from a carbon finance perspective. However, and interestingly, these returns that are shown here are actually only from about 20% of all investable forest carbon sites. The vast majority of investable sites are actually not financially viable at the current carbon price of around $5 to $6 per ton. And the areas that are not viable, not financially viable, are the areas shown in yellow on this map. So you can see it's large parts of the Americas and Africa, and even parts of Papua New Guinea are not financially viable. And so from a conservation perspective, what this map is telling us also is that we may need other policy interventions to protect these unprofitable and yet threatened forests. Another important consideration is that the theoretical potential for climate mitigation can be quite different from what may be actually achievable on the ground, because there will always be practical constraints that are specific to the local or regional contexts that need to be considered. Now, to talk about constraints and for us to understand constraints, let me switch gears slightly and focus on reforestation as a climate solution. So in the previous few slides, I have been talking about protection as a solution. Now we pivot to reforestation, growing new forests. So recently, we also mapped the potential for reforestation in Southeast Asia. We find that in our region, there may be about 120 million hectares of degraded terrestrial forests, peat swamp forests, and mangroves that are biophysically suitable for reforestation. And the restoration of these degraded lands could potentially remove up to about 3.4 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year, remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, I mean. However, these so-called degraded lands may in fact be used by local communities as smallholder farmlands or home gardens. They could be growing food for their own subsistence or for sale in local markets. And appropriating these lands for reforestation could compromise the livelihoods, the food security, and the land rights of these land users, regardless of land ownership, right? These are the people who are using the land. Furthermore, reforestation may also require constant site maintenance and protection against threats, including, for example, threats from tree diebacks, tree diseases causing them to die off, threats from illegal logging, and threats from forest fires. So we find that as we start to consider and apply these different layers of constraints and considerations, the picture starts to change very quickly as well. The amount of land that is practically available for reforestation can quickly shrink from what we thought would be 120 million hectares to less than 8 million hectares across the region. And in the most constrained scenario, reforestation would remove less than 0.25 billion tons of CO2 per year, which is literally a fraction of the unconstrained potential, the theoretical potential. Therefore, it is really important to develop better ways of quantifying, mapping, and monitoring both the potential and the constraints of nature-based solutions to better inform decisions, and also for us to better prioritize our investments to get the biggest bang for our buck. So why should we care about these new knowledge and insights? I think these insights can tell us where there might be opportunities for Asian countries and our companies to reduce and remove our emissions, and even perhaps invest in generating nature-based carbon credits to capitalize on new economic opportunities. But just as importantly, the science can also alert us to what some of the constraints and some of the risks might be, the constraints that are specific to our region and our countries. In fact, given that Singapore has such an intimate knowledge of the socio-economic, cultural, and geopolitical context of this region, I think it makes good sense for Singapore to invest in producing such policy relevant science, and for Singapore and our IHLs, our universities and research institutions to serve as knowledge hubs for climate solutions in this region. So let's continue on to part 3. In this part, I will run through a few slides to give you a flavor of some of the priority research questions that we at the center are tackling next. So nature-based solutions are important not just for climate change mitigation, but they are also hugely important for the many other ecosystem services and benefits they provide to society. And these include biodiversity conservation, of course, includes ensuring clean air and water, protecting our topsoil, safeguarding food security, protection against extreme weather events, and sustaining livelihoods. So for example, a recent study estimated that mangroves provide flood protection benefits exceeding $65 billion per year at the global level. So our team is currently working on quantifying and mapping the co-benefits of nature-based climate solutions in our region. Among the many co-benefits of nature-based solutions, biodiversity is interesting because it is both a co-benefit and also a building block of healthy ecosystems. Right? When we invest in protecting a forest, we protect its biodiversity. And conversely, a high diversity of animals, of plants, of microbes in the forest ensures that the forest continues to perform its ecosystem functions, not just to sustain itself, but also to deliver ecosystem services to humans, including, of course, the services of carbon sequestration and storage. At the moment, this value of biodiversity is not properly reflected or internalized in carbon pricing. So at the moment, 1 ton of carbon from a monoculture, a single species forest plantation, for example, can be priced the same as 1 ton of carbon from a highly diverse, pristine rainforest. But of course, we intuitively know that carbon from a pristine forest is so much more valuable than carbon from a monoculture. So our team is also exploring ways to quantify this price premium of what we call a beautiful carbon from a pristine rainforest. Now, so far we have focused on green carbon, which are terrestrial forests, and blue carbon, which are mangroves and seagrass meadows. But there are also several other kinds of high carbon ecosystems in what we call the carbon rainbow that have perhaps received less attention, including teal carbon. So teal is sort of in between blue and green, right? And these are the freshwater swamp forests like our Nee Soon swamp forest in Singapore and peat swamp forest, which everybody is familiar with. And then there are the gold carbon, which are the macroalgae or seaweeds, which is also a very important habitat and ecosystem for sequestering and storing carbon. And more importantly, we need to understand the interconnectedness and the interdependence between these ecosystems to fully understand and quantify the climate mitigation potential and co-benefits that these other high carbon ecosystems provide. So nature-based climate solutions are promising, but they are certainly not without risks. And there are three big risks in particular, and I'll talk about them in this slide. Now, just thinking in terms of forest protection as a nature-based solutions, protecting forests or forest conservation. Sometimes it can be quite challenging to benchmark additionality, which is to understand what would have happened if not for this intervention, if not for this action. So for example, if the threat of deforestation was inflated when we set out to protect forests, then our action of protecting that forest, our investment may not deliver the full extent of its intended outcome. Alternatively, if the threat is real, say because the forest is sitting on very productive lands for agriculture or forestry, then the pressure to develop the land will always be there. So how do we ensure the permanence of the solution after the project has ended, and maybe after the carbon credits are retired? And finally, there's also the risk of development being diverted elsewhere. Right? In our highly globalized and telecoupled society, it can be quite challenging to understand and mitigate this risk of what we call leakage, the diversion or the leakage of development from one area to another area. And therefore, it is important, very important, to develop better ways of accounting and mitigating these risks to inform our decisions and prioritize our solutions. Okay, so far I've been talking quite a bit about what my team and I have been doing. Now I would like to switch gears and pivot a bit and talk about who we are. CNCS, or the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions, is a new research facility at NUS in Singapore. With this center, what we are hoping to do is to bring together researchers from across different disciplines, departments, faculties, and even universities to pool our resources and expertise to work towards a common goal. The research interests and expertise of the center's researchers are very diverse. They include marine biology, mangrove ecology, forest ecology, as well as conservation science, remote sensing, spatial prioritization, and also environmental policy, governance, and law. The center is invested in 5 main areas of research, 5 strategic areas of research. So in terms of understanding impacts of climate change, I think as a small country, Singapore is heavily dependent on trade and therefore highly vulnerable to climate impacts in the region and globally. And the most obvious risk or impact, potential impact to us is the impact on our food security. For example, if there's an impact, if climate change affects food production in the region, and that will have a quite a severe consequence on our food security in Singapore. But this is only just one, right? Food security is just one potential indirect impact. Are there other more insidious impacts that we may need to prepare for? And what are these things? So this is what the center is also interested to understand more of. And then in terms of solutions, there are many unknowns and knowledge gaps on the potential and limits of nature-based solutions in our region. In the earlier part of this seminar, I shared some of the new research and insights that have come out of our recent research, but there could be many others. For example, there may be scope to integrate nature-based and human-engineered solutions to help us not just mitigate, but also adapt to climate change. And so we're also investing in that area. Then in terms of barriers, what are some of the economic, societal, cultural, policy, geopolitical barriers to the uptake of nature-based solutions in our region? And perhaps more importantly, how can we overcome these barriers? In terms of prioritization, because we may only have a few decades left to draw down our emissions, protect our forests, and rehabilitate our lands, we really don't have much time. What do we prioritize? Where do we prioritize our efforts? And how do we do it to get the biggest bang for our buck? And finally, technology is a theme that cuts across all our research programs. We believe there is scope to use technology to increase the cost effectiveness of our research, of our mapping and monitoring and prioritizing, as well as to use technology to increase the efficiency and productivity of our solutions, of actually implementing those solutions. And also for capacity building, to raise the level of conversations and discussions around climate issues in society. Now, to tackle those research questions, we use a wide range of research techniques. We collect empirical data through lab work, field work, and remote sensing. And these data sets are critical for our analytical work to map, to monitor, and to inform the optimization and prioritization of these nature-based solutions. Now, obviously, we can't do this alone. We have been very proactively engaging with various stakeholders in Singapore and internationally. And these partners and potential partners come from different sectors, including other academic institutions, NGOs, civil society, government agencies, and many corporates. I think one of the most valuable insights that we are receiving from our engagements with these multi-sectorial stakeholders is understanding the problems, the critical and most immediate problems that we can then invest the center's resources to attack and come up with policy relevant insights and solutions. So this would be my final slide. I just want to make the point and share the center's mission. There are two key missions for our center. The top priority is, of course, to produce evidence-based, interdisciplinary, and most importantly, policy-relevant science to inform climate strategies, policies, and actions, not just in Singapore, but also the region. And our second and equally important goal is to build capacity, to empower our leaders in the public and private sector to respond appropriately and decisively to climate challenges and other environmental challenges, and also to capitalize on new opportunities. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Koh. That was a really comprehensive introduction to your work and the work of the center. And we already have questions coming in on the chat. So we're going to start with the question from Alberto Salvo. Alberto, shall I read your question or do you want to ask it? Okay, I don't hear Alberto, so I'm just going to read it for everyone. Not sure if everyone can see the chat, right? So Prof. Koh, you stated carbon removal flows from existing forests. So can you elaborate on the main mechanisms behind these negative emissions? Yeah, especially when the forests are already standing and old.
Right. I'm not sure which slide you're referring to, but if you're talking about the mechanisms by which forests sequester carbon, it's simply photosynthesis, right? So they absorb CO2 and they incorporate the organic carbon into their biomass. But I suppose you could also be referring to the fact that some forests, or in some parts of the world, maybe carbon sinks, they may be net sinks, which means they help to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But in other parts of the world, they could actually be net emitters or sources of carbon. And that's actually a very interesting and important consideration. And it relates to how there could be feedback loops when it comes to global warming, right? In some parts of the world, under certain environmental and climate conditions, the forest might actually be emitting more carbon as they respire, because plants like humans and other organisms, most other organisms, respire, right? So when we respire, we emit or release CO2. The reason why plants could potentially be net sinks, be net absorbers of CO2 is also because they also are able to photosynthesize. So it's really a balance between photosynthesis, which absorbs CO2, and respiration, which releases CO2. So depending on the environmental and climatic conditions, the balance would determine, the balance between photosynthesis and respiration would determine whether carbon dioxide is released or absorbed as a net effect.
Just very briefly, very briefly. So I wasn't able to step in before because I could not unmute. But yeah, that's precisely my question. I think there's a common confusion in the sense that when a forest is growing, right, or just you're planting a tree and it's capturing carbon as it grows, you can see the carbon, locked, just in the wood. But for a standing forest and a pristine forest, it's not obvious to many people how, like through the photosynthesis, but the carbon, where does it end up being stored out of the atmosphere when it's already existing in an old forest? Of course, not cutting it down, you avoid emitting that carbon into the atmosphere. So that already is a gain, right, relative to the scenario where it's chopped down. But so that was my question.
Right. Maybe I can also just add to my response. In terms of, even for standing forests, old growth forests, they are still continuing to sequester carbon. And a lot of the carbon are stored not just in their biomass, in their trunks, branches and leaves and roots, but also in the soil below these forests. They're incorporated by the activity of and interactions between the trees and microbes in the soil. A lot of the organic carbon are also locked in the soil, and also in some ecosystems where the environment might be waterlogged, such as in many freshwater swamp forests and peat swamp forests, because of the lack of oxygen in the soil due to the water that's above the ground. Whatever organic compounds, the leaves, the dead branches, and so on, that fall down to the ground, to the soil, cannot decompose rapidly, and so that also becomes a storage, a store of organic compound. And in fact, for many of these waterlogged freshwater swamp forests and peat swamp forests, most of their carbon, the biggest carbon pool, we call it, is actually in the soil below ground.
Thank you. So, Prof. Koh, we have a more general question. This is from Kian Long, and it's really about how we can encourage politicians to use science to guide their decision making. Yeah. Because of course in politics, it's not just all about science, there's emotion and so on. So how can scientists ensure that science is truly being heard and considered?
Sure. I think when we refer to science, when we say science, there are many types of science. There's social science, there's the natural sciences, and so on. So even for us as scientists or natural scientists or social scientists or researchers in general, I think it's also very important for us to understand that there are many different priorities in society, and that there are many layers of information, and there are many trade-offs to be understood, to be clarified, and to be weighed against one another. So what we do at our center, because it's very interdisciplinary, and because we are trying to inform policy, we very explicitly consider these different dimensions, the different priorities of society. So in the slide I presented earlier on reforestation, right? You can see how we very explicitly thought about the constraints, the on-the-ground constraints of reforestation, that many of the sites, even if they are biophysically suitable for reforestation, socially they may not be suitable for reforestation. We cannot touch some of those lands because there are people there, there are farmers there, and also on other lands, maybe they are biophysically suitable for reforestation, but still actually not operationally suitable for reforestation because they are far away from urban centers, and hence there's not enough manpower or labor force to support the operations of that reforestation project. So a lot of these different dimensions could potentially be considered even by us as scientists before we bring our science to the decision makers. So I think when we think about any of these emerging environmental climate issues, especially those that concern land use or other segments of society, we really need to have a very comprehensive assessment and understanding of the different priorities and try to clarify them before we bring our science to the decision makers.
Yeah, thank you. And I think in your answer, you actually did answer a separate question by Daniel on how to increase the available land area for reforestation and restoration. Yeah. And I think you mentioned the need for conversation.
Actually, I can add to that actually because it's a very interesting question. Increase the area of land for reforestation. Yeah. In some parts of the world, maybe not specifically in Singapore or even our region, but in some parts of the world, there's a trend whereby a lot of the previous generations of farmers are giving up on their farming culture, right, or practice because their children and grandchildren are moving into cities and taking on other careers and opportunities. So as a result, a lot of the farmlands are being abandoned, and many of them are reverting back to forests. So I think those land areas could be quite substantial and could be suitable for reforestation as well, because rather than leaving it to be barren or to be converted to other users, we could work with governments or come up with suggestions to convert those to reforestation projects, and also help to clarify the benefits, both climate-wise, biodiversity-wise, and even financially, how converting those abandoned farmlands to reforestation projects or sites could be very beneficial for society. Audrey, can you still hear me?
So I think Audrey is frozen for a moment, or oh, she's back. Okay.
Okay. Or Alberto, do you want to just pick the next question and we can continue?
Audrey, I think you have to unmute.
Sorry.
Maybe I ask the next question until we have Audrey back.
Carbon credits and so on. All these are just provide avenues for people to greenwash. So what do you think of that?
Audrey, you got, I could only hear the last part of the question.
Oh, okay, sorry. So it's
okay, so maybe her connection is not that good. Alberto, do you know which question she's referring to?
Yeah, so, right. So there's a question by Tan Winsome asking about whether this ongoing argument against forest carbon credits. So let me try to understand it first before I ask you. So why don't I read it out so we can, or you can think about it as well. So there is an ongoing argument against forest carbon credits for offsetting. So there's an argument against carbon credits. That is a form of greenwashing for high emissions industries.
So yeah, I think that's enough. I have enough to go on.
Okay, good.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's a very interesting and important question to consider. There is indeed kind of a school of thought that is against carbon offsets because for various reasons, right? One is greenwashing. The other is that it might be a way for heavy emitters to get away with not doing anything to actually reduce their emissions or improve their energy efficiency or transition to renewable energies. So I think it's, first and foremost, it's still critical and most important to decarbonize, as I had shown in the earlier slides, right? For all IPCC pathways, the gray part of the curve of each of those pathways is still the most important thing to do. It's the bulk of what we need to do, decarbonize. But the important insight also is that there is that brown part, right? That's the nature-based part that we also have to act on. And without the brown part, acting on the gray part, the decarbonization part, may not be enough for us to achieve those targets. So that is the overall picture. But of course, there would be many challenges and risks. And one of the problems with nature-based offsets or carbon offsets is to do with the quality of this particular type of carbon offsets, to do with its credibility and its integrity, right? At the moment, in the voluntary carbon market, it's still quite a wild west. There's still a lot of, it's a mixed bag of nature-based carbon credits in terms of quality. Some projects are able to deliver what they promise. Others are not able to do that. So in Singapore, there's a group of us in the public and private sectors, and also in academia, who are looking into this issue and very seriously. And we do want to find ways through science and through developing technologies to improve the integrity and the credibility of nature-based carbon offsets and as a solution, and also as an opportunity. And one example I can give that could potentially address one of the issues is to use remote sensing based technologies to for us to be able to transparently validate and monitor these carbon projects on the ground, potentially even in real time or near real time. So we know exactly what's happening, that the forest conservation project is actually, in fact, conserving its forests and delivering the amount of carbon credits that it promises to do. So very important question, and the short answer is we are on top of it, we are aware of it, and many of us are working hard to address this issue.
It's great to hear that. So sorry, my connection broke, but I'm back. So Lian Pin, could you elaborate a bit more? Because I saw from your bio, you were working with drones as well. So is that part of your monitoring and surveillance?
That's one of the platforms or one of the ways by which we can collect data. It's a very important way to do so because drones these days are very user-friendly, they're very affordable, they're very accessible to many communities. So in fact, for a lot of the communities, local communities on the ground, in the forest or managing the forest, they could be using drones to constantly monitor and map their forests to ensure that that the forest is being protected, to watch out for illegal loggers, to watch out for threats of forest fires and then other issues around the area. So drones are very important way to collect the data that we need to improve the transparency and the quality of these carbon credits.
Yeah, great to hear that. So there were a couple of other questions that had to do with other countries. There was one question which asked for your opinion on what China has done for the climate. Perhaps you could give your evaluation. And then there was another question on engaging Indonesia and Malaysia in such efforts. So perhaps you could talk about them either as a group or, one after the other.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Maybe I'll take them as a group. I'm in fact not very familiar with the China context, but a bit more familiar with Malaysia and Indonesia. Obviously, in the Southeast Asia region, Malaysia and Indonesia are potentially important suppliers of carbon offsets or carbon credits, or they are important players in terms of nature-based climate solutions, simply because there's a huge amount of natural resources, natural ecosystems that are still standing, especially in Indonesia. So that's also partly why I think carbon finance and climate finance could be an important incentive for Indonesia to get serious about protecting and managing its natural resources, and be an important partner to countries in the region that would need these kinds of nature-based carbon offsets. Obviously, as I had mentioned also earlier in one of my slides, carbon finance alone would not be enough to protect these forests because of various reasons, finance being one of them. So there would need to be also policy interventions and enforcement of those policies in these countries to ensure that all of the remaining forests, or most of the remaining forests, would be successfully protected.
Appreciate that. And now we have a follow-up question to sorry, you have to go back to the issue of remote sensing. So there's a question from Danny about standards. Are there any standards that might improve the integrity and the credibility of these initiatives? I suppose there's a bit of a worry there about things like privacy and the validity of the data and so on.
Okay. Yeah, so when we talk about standards, usually we talk about the standards of ensuring the quality of these nature-based credits. But you're also talking about privacy, which is a separate issue. So maybe I'll talk about in something that is more related to the topic today, which is standards, carbon standards that are out there and which projects need to adhere to and follow for their carbon projects to be certifiable or to be certified, to ensure a certain quality in terms of the carbon credits that the projects could be generating. So on this issue, currently the carbon standards, the voluntary carbon standards and other certifying bodies for nature-based carbon projects are available, but there is obviously a lot of room for improvement. Some people in both the public and private sectors believe that the standards as they are today are not high enough, and that is one of the reasons why the quality of nature-based carbon credits today is a bit heterogeneous. It's a mixed bag. There are good ones and bad ones. So some of us are also working hard to try to come up with technology-based methods to improve these standards, which would be important not just to increase the quality of the carbon credits that could be generated, but also potentially reduce the cost of validating or verifying and certifying these carbon projects. So standards is definitely something important to consider when we think about nature-based carbon credits and offsets.
Yeah, thank you. There was a question from Priscilla about, order of preference, right? So, and this was related to Gavin's question about preference for, nature-based solutions versus, other factors like politics, financial considerations, and so on, right? Carbon potential. So I think it's a question about order of priority. Would you have any comments on that?
I'm actually not very sure what the question.
Yeah,
So maybe I can interpret it one way.
I think the order of stakeholders and order of criteria, do you have like a certain set of, ordering of preferences or priorities?
Okay. I think it always boils down to the local context or the national context, right? Or even the regional context. Different societies will have different sets of priorities and the order of their priorities. But I think climate change or addressing climate change is definitely one of the top priorities. Perhaps for countries like Singapore, which is very land scarce, and there would be many other competing priorities and uses for the land. It's a really wicked problem, right? Like many others have mentioned before. I'm not sure if I am giving a useful answer, but I think in general it really depends on the local context.
Sorry, Priscilla here. So actually my question was more around the order of preference in terms of one nature-based solution versus another, rather than for the criteria. So all things considered, all the criteria being equal or equally considered.
Okay, sure. That's a very good question. Yes. So I think, personally, I think it's always more important to protect what we already have, what we currently have, which are the standing forests, right? For various reasons. One, because if we lose them, then we are in effect emitting carbon, right? You cut down a tree today, you are in effect emitting the carbon to the atmosphere and contributing and exacerbating the climate change problem. Secondly, it takes a long time for a forest to grow, right? And also not just in terms of the carbon stock that is accumulating in the biomass, but also in terms of the biodiversity that is in the forest, both above ground in the forest itself and also underground, the microbes and so on. And so when we cut down a forest, we lose all of that, and we lose the decades or centuries of time that it took the forest to grow to that stage. So between forest protection and reforestation, I think it's in the first instance, we need to protect what we have. And then after that, we grow. Of course, we will want to grow new forests to also remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere.
Right. Good. So I think in that answer, you actually answered the question from Bufan. Yeah. So thanks, Bufan. So the last question, we have only time for one more question, goes to Dr. Gaimin. Can you tell us more about marine nature-based solutions? How important and implementable are they? And how much of your research will target them?
Yeah, sure. Another very good question. In terms of the marine environment, we actually know comparatively less about them compared to terrestrial systems. And when we talk about marine, we usually talk about the coastal ecosystems, mangroves, seagrass, seaweeds. But there's also the big ocean. There's another huge potential source/sink. We know very little about the deep ocean. So in terms of coastal ecosystems, mangroves are obviously has been in the limelight for a while. a lot of attention has been focused on it. And I also briefly mentioned mangroves, mangrove blue carbon in one of my earlier slides. As I mentioned on that slide, the potential of mangroves globally to contribute to climate mitigation is actually quite small compared to the terrestrial forests. But that only refers to the protection of mangroves. There is, of course, also scope to grow new mangroves, and that's another area of research that hasn't been done, and we're hoping to invest in that research as well to understand how much carbon dioxide can we capture if we make use of all the suitable land or most of the suitable land around the world where we can rehabilitate or grow new mangroves. But even if the climate mitigation potential of mangroves would be smaller than the inland forests, as I also mentioned earlier, mangroves are still very important for many other reasons. For the local livelihoods, they are nurseries for a lot of our fisheries and so on. So it's still very important to protect mangroves. The other marine or coastal ecosystems that could potentially be important carbon sinks are seagrasses and seaweeds. And that we know even less about those two than mangroves. So those are also very active areas of research, also active areas of research at our center. So if there are people in the audience today who are interested in blue carbon or marine ecosystems and how they could contribute to climate change mitigation, please do come and talk to us, either as potential partners or even maybe students at our center.
All right, thank you very much, Prof. Koh. And I see from the chat that there are additional questions, but we are out of time. So we shall forward the additional questions to you. And perhaps the people who asked you those questions can get in touch as well. It's great to see all the interest in what you have presented. So we thank you very much, Prof. Koh, for spending your evening with us. And we thank the audience for your very active participation. Have a great weekend. Bye.
Thank you, Audrey, and thanks everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you. Bye for now. So we shall save the chat. Yeah, thank you.